What's up, everybody? Rob here. So, one of my favorite games of all time was Age of Empires 2, Age of Kings, and the Conqueror's expansion pack. It's something that really sparked my interest in history. I mean, I was already interested in history at that point, but this really just fueled it even more. And I spent countless hours just playing, all the different factions, and it's just, it's a fantastic game, and anybody who's ever played this, I'm sure you're going to agree with me. I've never met anybody who actually didn't like this game. Whatever. Well, in any case, the game brought to my attention the special unit of the Turks, namely the Janissaries. Now, in the game, they are portrayed as a ranged gunpowder unit, and they specialized in just massed volumes of fire, and they spent most of their time completely shredding any formations I had. I usually played as the Teutons, which had a very slow grinding advance, and they played absolutely havoc with my formations. In real life, the Janissaries were soldiers of the Ottoman Empire and basically were slave soldiers to the Sultan. But beyond that, I really didn't know much beyond it. So here, without any further ado, is a very brief look at the historical Janissaries. Okay, so the name Janissary comes from the Turkish word, and I apologize for mispronouncing this, Janissaries. It's there on the screen. Anyway, it means new soldier, and were formed initially in the late 1300s under the reign of Sultan Murad I of the Ottoman Empire. The Janissaries were initially instituted as a fighting force that would be loyal to the Sultan and the Sultan only. And they were, at least initially, recruited, if recruitment is really the right word for this, drafted is possibly another word, by the use of the, and I'm going to mispronounce this, I'm very sorry, the Devashrim system, which was the kidnapping and enslaving of young Christian boys who would then be pressed into service in the Ottoman military. Now, these recruits would be taken from throughout the Ottoman Empire, but mostly they would come from the Balkans. Now, this mirrors an Ottoman practice of using conquered people as cannon fodder for protecting their own troops, and was really just taken to the next level. In any case, these Christian children would be taken from their families and converted to Islam. Maybe. I've tried to find some, actual definitive statement on this. Now, there's no doubt that the children that would be taken to become Janissaries would be given a full education in the teachings and tenets of Islam. However, it is pretty unclear whether or not they actually became fully Muslim, since the Janissaries were slave soldiers, and according to Islamic law, it is forbidden for one Muslim to enslave another. So because of the ambiguity of the information I've been given, I'm not really certain if they were fully converted or if they were only, indoctrinated into the ideology but not fully converted, in any official sense. I'm really unclear on that. That's, a failing on my part, I know, but, limitations, I have them. And, again, I'm not an expert on this subject by any stretch of the imagination. But that's enough of a digression. Let's move on. Over time, the Janissaries would become much more selective, recruiting only the best physical candidates to fill up their ranks. The Janissaries were not allowed to wear full beards, but instead only mustaches, which became a symbol of their rank within Ottoman society. They were also not allowed to marry or take up any trade other than soldiering. Now, this was true at least initially with the first few centuries of the Janissary Corps' existence, but eventually this very strict form of discipline would wear over time, and they would be eventually allowed to marry and take up trades to supplement their incomes from soldiering. And actually, the Janissaries became, instead of these just slave soldiers, became very prestigious, and by the 17th century, the Ottomans themselves were volunteering their children for Janissary service. The Janissary Corps grew so powerful and influential both militarily and economically that they rivaled the Ottoman aristocracy for power and political influence. Now, they became less and less of a military institution as time went on, and really just became more of just another branch of the Ottoman governmental bureaucracy, until they were eventually abolished in 1826 after a failed rebellion, in which the Janissary barracks would be lit on fire, and many were killed, and the remainder were executed or thrown into exile. But more on that a bit later. As a professional military unit, the Janissaries were one of the first to have a specific uniform, namely baggy trousers and the distinctive pointed headgear, which marked them as separate from the rest of the Ottoman military. They were also one of the first units in the modern era to use music as a way for soldiers to keep pace while on the move, using drums and trumpets amongst other wind instruments. The strength of the Janissary Corps varied greatly over the years, starting out at their inception with about 1,000 members, and increasing in size until the 18th century with a strength of over 40,000. The Janissaries were organized into regiments known as ortas, and each orta was led by a korbaki, or korbachi. That, you see it there in front of you. Anyway, the symbol of rank for this particular individual was a soup ladle, showing first and foremost his humility to the Sultan. But there's also another reason for the symbology of the soup ladle. You see, the Janissaries were forced to cut off all ties with their families, and therefore their fellow Janissaries would become their family. And they would bond over the communal hearth, where meals would be prepared, and they would all pretty much eat together, kind of like vaguely like the Spartans. They would have a common mess that they would all gather around, and your common mess would become your new family. So the commander having the soup ladle was symbolically showing the ties that the Janissaries have to one another, sort of like their surrogate family bonds. Now, the Janissary Corps on a whole would be under the command of the Sultan, at least on paper, but was directly controlled by a supreme aga, or commander. The main role of the Janissaries on the battlefield was that of ranged infantry. They would initially be issued bows and arrows as their main weapon, but as the centuries progressed, they were eager adopters of firearms and were one of the first units to actually use firearms in a large scale. Now, although their primary task was that of ranged combatant, sometimes melee combat, close quarter battle, was necessary. In times like that, the Janissaries would use a wide variety of weaponry, including spears, swords, axes, and what you see here is a yataghan, which is a uniquely Ottoman weapon. It looks vaguely like I guess you can say like a falcata or something like that. It's got a curved blade with the inside of the curve being the sharpened one. It doesn't have a handguard, so you can see this is not really that good for fencing or dueling. It leaves the hands pretty vulnerable, I would think, but hey, it worked for them. So in any case, yeah, this was actually fairly common and was actually one of the more common types of secondary weapon used by the Janissaries, so much so that some consider it to be a calling card of the Janissaries, although they were not the only ones to use it. The Janissaries also had specialist units, such as sappers and engineers, as well as sharpshooters, and they also made extensive use of grenades, or at least, very primitive hand bombs, which we would consider today to be, a prototype of a grenade. In battle, their primary role was to guard the Sultan. Again, they were there specifically to be loyal to him, and they were his bodyguards, and the Sultan would always be accompanied on the battlefield by a detachment of Janissaries. Outside of their job as being bodyguards for the Sultan while on the battlefield, they would also be used as shock troops to breach enemy lines, or to exploit a breach in enemy lines. So this could be done either on the battlefield against troops in the field, or it could be done, say, storming the walls of a city. The principle is still the same. The Ottomans would use artillery or other types of ranged units. Especially against like a city wall, they would use giant cannons and blast holes in the walls. And then they would send in other troops, not the Janissaries, but they would send in waves of other troops to overwhelm the defenders. The enemy could repulse these other troops, but they would be expending ammunition and honestly just getting tired and worn out from the near constant wave of Ottoman soldiers that are being thrown at them. And then once the enemy was basically too tired to continue fighting, or basically spread too thin to be all that effective, the Janissaries would then pour into the breach or pour into these weak points and overwhelm the enemy with massed firepower. Basically, it was an early modern version of shock and awe. Just basically find a weak point and pour massive firepower into it until the enemy collapsed, and then the Janissaries were able to then exploit that breach and cause the enemy to rout. The Janissaries were a key to the Ottoman victory of Constantinople in 1453, eventually securing the breach in the walls of the city, and played pivotal roles in the battle against Iranian Safavids in 1514, as well as a major part in the defeat of Mameluke armies at Marj Dabik in 1516. Probably their most impressive display of arms, however, was in 1526 at the Battle of Mohacs. During this battle, the Hungarians were defeated after a section of their army was absolutely devastated by concentrated and highly accurate Janissary musket and artillery fire. In spite of their prestigious record, the Janissaries would eventually become outdated. As the centuries progressed, they became more and more involved in Ottoman politics and would foment several rebellions against the government. Now, much of the 18th century, the Ottomans spent trying to update themselves to the rapid pace of change that was taking place in Europe. The Janissaries felt threatened by this, thought that they had no longer any place in the new modern world, and did what they could to slow down the pace of technological and cultural advancements that were being imported in from the West. In spite of their efforts, however, by the early 19th century, it was pretty much clear that the Janissaries no longer had any place in the rapidly evolving world. This became especially apparent under the reign of Muhammad II, who basically made a point of his reign to modernize the country as much as possible, especially the military. And in 1826, the Janissaries mutinied. The revolting Janissaries were met by troops that were now organized under Western lines. Now, joining the government troops may have been local residents. Now, there's some controversy about this, but the local residents hated the Janissaries due to years of abuse at their hands and were more than happy to help out with their destruction. In any case, the government troops pushed the Janissaries back to their barracks. Now, some people believe that the Sultan actually provoked the Janissaries into revolting, hinting very strongly that they would be replaced, like basically trying to do what he could to force the Janissaries to revolt so he had an excuse to put them down. Whether this is true or not, again, is some degree of controversy there, but whatever. In any case, with the Janissaries stuck in their barracks, the buildings were shelled with artillery and eventually set on fire, which killed about 4,000 of them. Scores more were killed in brutal fighting throughout the streets of Constantinople. Eventually, the revolt was crushed. The leadership of the Janissaries were captured and executed, and the younger members were imprisoned or sent into exile, and their possessions would ultimately be seized by the Sultan. Thus ended nearly 4 centuries of this elite fighting force. So that's it for the video. Nothing particularly extensive here, just something I had some interest in, didn't know much about. I'm not very familiar with the Ottoman Empire at all, actually. It's a big gap in my knowledge base, but it was interesting to look up, and I figured I'd share what I learned with all of you guys. In any case, please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos coming out whenever I get around to it. And have a good day. Or don't have a good day. You're adults. Have any kind of day you want. See you later.